Welcome, friend. I'm Jack, host of the channel, and today we're diving into another episode. Pour yourself a drink and get comfortable, because I've got a powerful story coming your way. If something hits deep, drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's get into it.
Did you know that most high school romances last only about 3 weeks? However, Julia Carter and Stephen Hughes broke that record by nearly 35 years. They met when Julia was just a freshman and Stephen was a sophomore, and from that moment they were inseparable. They had what many would call a mythical love, the kind that seemed like it could stand the test of time. I thought we were really happy. Our marriage felt satisfying, and when Julia gave birth to our daughter, Lisa, it brought us even closer together. I was content during those years. Let me introduce myself to provide some context for this story. My name is John Lewis, and Julia has been my wife for the past 25 years. As I mentioned earlier, Julia and Stephen dated throughout high school, and yes, she lost her virginity to him. Most high school romances end eventually, but in this case, it was more like a temporary pause. Stephen, being a year older than Julia, decided to earn a lot of money after high school so he could marry her. That's what my wife says, and she mentioned it often throughout our marriage. After graduating from high school, Stephen went to work on an oil rig in Texas with his uncle, and that's when things started to unravel. It seems Stephen stopped writing shortly after getting there, leaving Julia alone during her senior year. She eventually started dating a guy named Tim or Tom, but it wasn't serious. Her heart still belonged to her first love, Stephen. Julia waited patiently, like an obedient girlfriend, but Stephen was distant and not very communicative. Apparently, Stephen loved the adventurous life on the rig and started living a rather nomadic lifestyle, believing that his beloved Julia was still waiting for him to return wealthy and sweep her off her feet. Unfortunately, that was far from what happened. Life went on, as it does, and nothing stayed the same. This was true for Julia, who went to college, earned her degree, and met me at a party when she was 22. I was a little older, at 27, but we made a great couple. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her and believed she felt the same about me. Our marriage was quite typical, except for one minor hiccup 2 days before our wedding. A letter arrived from Stephen announcing that he was finally coming back and wanted to see Julia. Just like the prodigal son, he wanted to return. Thank goodness Julia's mother convinced her not to meet him, saying she had a new life ahead and shouldn't waste her time on that fool, as she called him. After several emotional conversations during which I feared she might call off the wedding, Julia went through with the ceremony, becoming my wife, Mrs. Julia Lewis. When Stephen finally made an appearance, it was too late. Julia and I were already on our honeymoon. Stephen, apparently crushed, enlisted in the Navy in his state of despair. After our honeymoon, we settled into our new roles. Julia became a nurse, and I worked as an insurance claims adjuster for a large insurance firm. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it was stable and paid the bills. Our marriage was solid, but one small issue kept recurring. Stephen began texting Julia, and she eagerly responded. When I asked her why this was necessary, she became defensive, saying, "Oh, John, don't be jealous. He's an old friend who's single and serving in the Navy, and I'm just writing to keep his spirits up." I couldn't pretend not to notice that he wrote to her regularly, and I also knew that she responded just as frequently. Neither her family nor I could convince her to stop until she received a letter saying that Stephen had married a woman where he was stationed. This news ended the correspondence and restored my peace of mind. Over the next 3 years, I think she received 3 Christmas cards from Stephen, and that was it. During this lull in communication with Stephen, our daughter Lisa was born. With our baby in hand, Julia and I pulled together like a team and worked hard to build a home and create a good life for Lisa. Yes, life was good back then, and we both put our hearts into raising our child. But, as is often the case, something eventually comes along to spoil it. One day, Julia received a letter from Stephen. She never spoke about it, but I noticed an increase in our postage usage after that. I concluded that she was writing to Stephen again, but I decided to ignore it. After all, he was out there supposedly making the world safe for democracy. while I was here ensuring the safety of my family's world. If they wanted to exchange letters, that was their business, regardless of how I felt. Eventually, Julia began sharing some of the news she had received from Stephen. He had divorced his first wife and remarried. He had seen combat and was apparently highly decorated. I listened with half an ear, but Julia spoke with pride about her Navy man. I corrected her once, saying he would be offended if they called him a soldier since he was a sailor. Julia giggled sweetly and replied, "Oh, I think I better watch this." Watching her talk about him really hurt, but I hoped that one day she would finally forget him and focus on her family. Sadly, she never did. Stephen had served in the Navy for 30 years, had been married and divorced 3 times, and had enough medals to make even the most decorated generals envious. I realized with dread that while Stephen had grown more attractive to my wife over the years, I had just grown older and more predictable. My only hope was that once Stephen left the Navy, he would settle far away from us. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be, and here we are now. Our daughter Lisa is now grown, married to a wonderful man named Jake Collins, and expecting their first child. I am 55 and eagerly awaiting the magical age of 60 so I can retire and enjoy my last few years in peace and tranquility. Julia still looks stunning and can still make my heart race. Little did I know that the calm of my life was about to be shattered. It was a Thursday when I came home to find Julia all dressed up, telling me we had a dinner reservation at 7 p.m. At first, I thought I had forgotten an anniversary or birthday, but after quickly doing some mental math, I realized that wasn't the case. I decided to play along and went to our bedroom to freshen up and try to look as dashing as Julia. Dinner was fantastic, and the restaurant was bustling with activity, which made me suspect that Julia had something more on her mind than just a nice meal. Toward the end of our meal, I looked at her and said, "Okay, now you can drop the bomb. I'm in a good mood and won't cause a scene." One of my quirks is that I never get angry in public. In my line of work, you learn to never lose your cool, and that habit carried over into my personal life. Julia knew this, and over the years, whenever she had something to tell me that might upset me, she would bring me to a public place to break the news. Tonight, just from her expression, I sensed something bad was coming. After 25 years together, you learn how to read your partner. I had a sinking feeling in my gut that tonight was going to be rough. Finally, with visible hesitation, she broke the news. "John, I think you should know that Stephen is back." I suddenly felt a wave of nausea, but I knew it wasn't because of the food. I stared at her for a few moments, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but Julia just looked at me intently. I finally broke the awkward silence. "When you say back, do you mean he's on vacation?" She shook her head slowly. "No, John, he's not on vacation. He was discharged from the Navy and bought a house 2 streets away from us." With that, my panic level began to rise. I quickly interjected, "And he's going to live there with his, what, 3rd wife?" Again, she said quietly, "No, he got divorced again, but this time he lost part of his pension to her." I tried to hold back my anger, but couldn't help blurting out, "Damn," a bit too loudly. A couple of diners at the nearby table glanced over at me. My frustration wasn't because Stephen had lost part of his pension to his ex-wife, but because he had moved so close to us, and I was anxious to know why. I pressed on, "Julia, you haven't met Stephen, have you?" The look on her face was enough of an answer. She didn't even need to speak when I asked my next question. "When and how, Julia?" She looked down, clearly troubled, and replied, "Yesterday. He stopped by our house to tell me that we're neighbors now." My heart pounded in my chest as I continued probing, afraid of what I might learn. "Did you sleep with him, Julia?" Once again, her face gave her away before she managed to whisper, "I did, John, but it's not what you think." I looked deep into her eyes, almost growling, "I think my supposedly faithful wife slept with someone other than her husband. Now, explain to me why this is not what I think it is." She responded, "I did it because he needed me. John, when he showed up, he looked so lost. He's going through some sort of crisis after his divorce, and he needed me badly. I love you, John, but I realize I still have feelings for Stephen, too. And there it was. My wife had slept with Stephen, using his PTSD and divorce as a ticket back into her heart and her bed. I stared at her intensely and spoke with a clarity I had rarely needed in our entire marriage. All right, Julia, the damage is done. We can get through this, but you cannot sleep with him again. Do you understand me? She looked back at me, tears filling her eyes, and replied quietly but firmly, I can't promise that. John, I love him, and he needs me even more than you. I was stunned by her words, but knew that a crowded restaurant was not the place to air our dirty laundry. I called for the check, and 10 minutes later, we were in the car, heading home. I pressed her again. Julia, how can you sleep with him knowing you have a husband? Do you remember the vows we made almost 25 years ago? Do you recall the part about forsaking all others? She began to sob openly and, through her tears, said, I'm sorry, John, but he needs me, and we found each other again. I can't stand the thought of losing either of you. I was at a loss for what to say that could change her mind. With a mixture of frustration and resignation in my voice, I asked, So what's your solution? Do we take turns? He gets you on New Year's, and I get you for Christmas? Stop it, Julia. You can't have two men. She stopped crying and looked at me with a strange calmness. How about a break, John? I was taken aback. What on earth are you talking about, Julia? She shifted topics. Remember about 15 years ago when you took a year off to go back to school and get your master's degree? You took the time, did what you needed to do, and then came back, and everything was fine. I shook my head in disbelief. Julia, how can you compare me getting a degree that benefited our family with your affair with this fool? That only benefits the two of you. We pulled into the driveway, and I turned off the engine. Julia reached out, gently touching my face as she pleaded, John, I missed out on my last year of high school with Stephen, and if I had that year, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation now. Give me this year with him, and I promise you that afterward, I will be the best wife I can be. Please, John, I need this. I was filled with a mixture of sadness, anger, and despair. I wanted to strangle Julia to make her pay for what she was suggesting, but I also remembered that nothing good ever comes from violence. After a long pause, I finally said, All right, Julia, if this is what you want, go ahead. And this is a big but, do not ask for my blessing, and I do not want to see or hear from you at all during this year. Understood, and keep in mind that in a year, you may not have anyone to come back to. I hoped that my strict conditions would dampen her enthusiasm, but she didn't seem to hear anything after I said, all right. She leaned over, kissed me on the cheek, and said, Thank you, John. You'll see, you won't regret it. I shook my head, replying, It's too late. I already do. That night, she wanted to make love, but I just couldn't bring myself to touch her. The thought of her with Stephen made me feel physically ill. As we were getting ready for bed, I took a pillow and told her I would be sleeping in the guest room. I saw the pain in her eyes and was oddly satisfied by it, hoping it would make her reconsider her break. The next morning, I woke up, praying that the previous night was just a nightmare and that Julia would have changed her mind. I was wrong. When I walked into the kitchen, she was making breakfast, looking as happy as a lottery winner. She smiled and pointed to the calendar hanging on the wall, where today's date, June 4th, was circled in thick black. I sat down, contemplating the irony. On this date in 1944, soldiers and sailors stormed the beaches to free Europe from tyranny. Today, I lost my wife to another oppressor. Julia practically danced as she brought me breakfast, saying, I know you're worried, John, but in a year I will be back, and I will be only yours. I just need this time to sort out my feelings, and I promise you, you won't regret it. She smiled at me, brimming with confidence. I called Stephen this morning while you were still asleep and told him you gave me permission for a break. He'll be here to pick me up in an hour. Every word felt like a dagger to my heart, but I tried one last time. Julia, you don't have to do this. Think it over. This is a foolish thing to do, and you might end up regretting it. You could lose everything we have. Please, I ask you not to destroy us." She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language, saying kindly, "John, I know how much you love me. By giving me this time, trust me, I know what I'm doing. I will come back, and our marriage will be stronger for it. Now, I need to finish packing, so please eat your breakfast." And just like that, she walked out of the kitchen and effectively out of our marriage. I finished eating, though the food tasted like ash, and went to get dressed. In the bedroom, I saw that Julia had 3 large suitcases filled with clothes and personal items. She smiled warmly at me and said, "I think I've got everything I need. Could you take these to the porch for Stephen?" I stared at her, cold and unmoved. "No." Her face fell, shocked by my refusal. I followed up, "If you're so determined to ruin 25 years of marriage, you can carry your bags with him. I'm not helping you get into this mess. Is that clear?" Julia looked like she was on the verge of tears before snapping back. "Stephen is not a fool, John. He is a wonderful man and a hero who served our country. That's more than you have ever done." I turned away, muttering, "Yes, he got medals, 3 meals a day, and traveled the world while I worked 5 days a week to support you and our daughter. I guess that means nothing." Julia dragged her bags downstairs to the driveway, giving me resentful looks with each trip. Moments later, a car pulled up to our house, and a man, Stephen, I presumed, got out and began loading her things. Julia yelled to him that she'd be right out, then came back inside to say goodbye to me. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. I broke the silence first. "If you're going to do this, remember the ground rules. I don't want to see you or hear from you for the entire year." The reality of what she was doing seemed to hit her, and she replied quietly, "I understand, John, but everything will work out. You'll see. You promised to give me a year." She waited for me to say something, but I remained silent. With a confused look, she finally said, "I really do love you." She tried to kiss me, but I turned my cheek. "I can't kiss you knowing you're going to him," I said, my voice hard. She broke down in tears and ran out the door into his arms. Standing in the doorway, I watched her kiss him passionately, a wave of rage rising within me. 2 minutes later, my driveway was as empty as my heart, and I realized that my wife was now another man's woman. I called in sick to work and went straight to the hardware store to buy new locks. I spent the morning changing the locks and updating the security system. It kept me occupied and kept my mind off Julia. But when I finished, the crushing sadness returned. To drown my sorrows, I turned off our home phone and got drunk, very drunk. This binge wasn't so much about enjoying the alcohol as it was about numbing the pain of losing Julia. But it didn't work. I continued drinking until Sunday morning, when I ran out of booze. It was just as well. I felt like I was on the brink of death, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I collapsed into bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to be woken by a persistent knocking somewhere in the house. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled around trying to locate the source of the sound, which turned out to be my daughter, Lisa, knocking on the front door. I let her in, and she immediately looked appalled by my state and the stench of alcohol that permeated the house. "What the hell is going on, Dad?" she asked. I tried to focus, the pounding in my head making it hard to think, but I managed to croak out, "What do you mean?" She looked at me like I was a stranger. She grabbed my arm and steered me toward the kitchen. "You need coffee and some food, Dad. Then you can explain what's happened." Later, after a meal and several cups of coffee, I told her everything about her mother and Stephen. To say she was shocked would be an understatement. "Dad, let me get this straight. She wants to take a year off from your marriage to reconnect with her high school boyfriend and see where it goes." I nodded. "Yes, something like that." She asked the question that had been on my mind since Friday. "What are you going to do, Dad?" I looked her in the eyes, and the answer came naturally. "Tomorrow, I'm calling in sick again and going to see a lawyer." She looked down, tears forming in her eyes. "I can't believe Mom would do this. Maybe she's lost her mind." I looked at her blankly. "Lisa, I don't know." She looked at me, her expression sadder than I had ever seen it. I don't know what to say. Dad, part of me wants to tell you to wait it out, but it seems like this is the right move. Lisa stayed with me a few more hours, cooking a dinner I'd probably throw away later. As she was leaving, she kissed me and apologized again. I asked, "Why did you come by today, anyway?" She looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern. "Mom called and asked me to check on you. She didn't say why." I nodded. "Okay, thanks. Drive safely, honey." The next day, I called in sick and went to meet with a lawyer. I felt vindicated when I explained the situation to him. Although the divorce would go in my favor due to Julia's actions, there was still a risk she could fight for a portion of my pension. Other marital assets were also in play. This year off could be my opportunity to liquidate those assets and protect my future. The next 3 weeks flew by. I was surprised at how quickly I adapted to being alone. On the positive side, I no longer felt responsible for another person. The downside was the loneliness, waking up alone, going to bed alone. I didn't hear from Julia until mid-August. One Saturday, I went to a bar in town, and who should walk in but Julia and Stephen, holding hands like teenagers. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice me sitting at the bar. I watched them for a while, observing Stephen. He was fit and attractive. I could see why Julia was drawn to him. But there was something off. He seemed to dominate her while she clung to his every word. When Julia finally noticed me, she looked shocked. She hesitated, then approached me cautiously. "Hello, John, how are you?" I wanted to tell her to leave, but instead I kept my composure. "Oh, about as well as can be expected when your wife of 25 years leaves you for another man. What can I do for you?" She seemed taken aback by my tone, but pressed on. "John, I need to get some things from the house. When I tried to use my key the other day, it didn't work." I kept my smile, but spoke firmly. "Well, Julia, you shouldn't be surprised that your key doesn't work in my house anymore, seeing as you don't live there." She stood there, looking confused. I added, "You should get back to your boyfriend before he starts to worry." Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned away and walked back to Stephen. I returned my attention to my drink, but moments later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder. I was spun around in my chair to face an angry Stephen. "Hey, pal, you made my woman cry, and I don't like it." I could feel the tension in the air. This guy could probably kill me before anyone could step in, but I stood my ground. "You mean my wife, not your woman, and since you took her, you have no right to interfere with what happens between us. Now, let me be clear. You can hit me if you want to impress her, but it won't look good when the cops show up." I saw him processing what I said, and it gave me the courage to push a little further. "You have two choices. Hit me and go to jail, or back off and sit down." My heart was racing, and a voice in my head was screaming, "What are you doing? He'll kill you." But I maintained my calm. Just then, the manager came over, asking what was going on. Stephen glared at him, muttering, "No problem," before backing off. A few minutes later, they paid their bill and left. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about what Julia could possibly want from the house. I spent the next few hours searching through closets and drawers, eventually finding a stash of letters from Stephen hidden under some clothes. As I read them, it became clear that this year off had been planned for a long time. One letter, dated 5 years ago, read, "It's a relief to know you miss me as much as I miss you. When I get back, we need to be together. You have to figure out a way to get rid of that weakling husband of yours." Reading through them all was like reading a bad romance novel, full of descriptions of what he planned to do with Julia and reminiscences about their high school days. By the time I finished, my resolve was stronger than ever. Life without Julia was going to be just fine. I didn't see or hear from Julia again until my birthday, September 1st. When I got home from work that day, there was a covered dish and a birthday card waiting on the porch. I brought them inside and discovered that she had made my favorite stew. The card was meant to wish me a happy birthday, but her message read, John, I know we're not supposed to be in contact, but I couldn't ignore the birthday of the man I love. I dream about us every night, and I know that when this year is over, I will be back completely yours, and he will be gone. Please, never stop loving me. Julia. My daughter Lisa had been keeping a close eye on me since Julia left and called me on my birthday. After some small talk, she got to the point. Dad, you know my due date is in 3 weeks, right? How could I forget my first grandchild's impending arrival? Yes, honey, I know. You and Jake must be so excited. A long pause followed, and I sensed something was wrong. Dad, Jake and I had dinner with Mom and Stephen. She wants to be there when the baby is born, and she wants Stephen to come too. I know you agreed to no contact for a year, but can you make an exception for me? Just this once. I was taken aback that Lisa and Jake had socialized with them, but I didn't want to spoil her joy. All right, Lisa, she can come, and if she needs to bring him, fine. Lisa was quick to respond. Dad, please stop calling him names. He's not a bad guy, and Mom seems really happy with him. I haven't seen her this happy in years. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I held my composure. Your grandmother called him a fool years ago. Nothing's changed. First, you're having dinner together, and now you're defending him. I guess he's quite the charmer. Next, he'll take my entire family. When do you plan on calling him Dad? Lisa quickly apologized. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. I cut her off. Forget it. I've got something in the oven. Behave yourself, Lisa. She said she loved me and hung up. It was at that moment that I realized my life had changed forever, and I had to take action. I began liquidating my assets to lower my net worth and started looking for ways to rebuild my life. The next few days were tense. I got legal advice on what to do with my assets, bought a stun gun for self-defense, and booked a trip to Las Vegas for October. I also went online to look for a woman around my age who might be interested in a stable, long-term relationship. Legally, since Julia had left our home, I had a lot of freedom in deciding what to do with our shared assets. If Julia thought she would come back to half of everything, she was in for a surprise. When Lisa gave birth, I was at work. My secretary answered the phone. It was Jake, elated to tell me I now had a grandson. I congratulated him and headed straight to the hospital. When I arrived, I went directly to Lisa's room. But as I approached, I overheard her talking to Julia. Mom, what you and Dad are doing is just stupid. Do you want to lose him to Stephen? Julia's voice was calm and soothing. Don't worry, Lisa. Your father won't leave me. He loves me too much. Besides, what I have with Stephen right now is incredible. Every day feels like high school, only better because we can be together fully. He treats me like a queen, and the intimacy is, beyond words. I will miss this when I go back to your father. Lisa's voice was filled with disgust. Mom, I don't need to hear about your love life with Stephen. Sure, he's charming and all, but I want my child to grow up with grandparents who are together, not separated or fighting. Please, Mom, think about going back to Dad before it's too late. He might be dull and predictable, but he's always been there for you. Stephen might be exciting now, but he's not dependable like Dad. Julia's voice, still dismissive, replied, You don't need to worry, Lisa. When I'm done with Stephen, your dad will gladly take me back. Lisa sounded skeptical. I think you're underestimating Dad. I've talked to him, and he's not the same since you left. Are you really willing to risk 25 years of marriage for a fling with your high school sweetheart? I had heard enough and chose that moment to enter. Hey, congratulations. Mommy, how's the new mom doing? I exclaimed with a forced smile. I hugged Lisa but ignored Julia. I knew it was petty, but it felt easier. Julia shot me a dirty look, but Lisa was overjoyed. Dad, have you seen him yet? I shook my head. No, sweetheart, I just wanted to see how you were doing first. Julia, visibly upset by my cold shoulder, interjected. Hello, John. How have you been? I looked at her for a moment and then turned my attention back to Lisa, asking her about the baby's name. Lisa's face lit up. We decided to name him John, after you, Dad. Hearing this, Julia left the room, clearly upset. After she was gone, I turned to Lisa and spoke seriously. Lisa, you know this thing with your mom and me isn't going to work out, right? Her face fell. No, Dad, don't say that. She'll come back to her senses. My eyes misted over. Sweetheart, I've realized I was never enough for your mother. Something's going to happen soon. Her face showed shock and disbelief. What do you mean? I smiled sadly. I'm going to start divorce proceedings soon. Lisa burst into tears. Oh, Dad, I told Mom to beg you to take her back, but it's too late, isn't it? I nodded. Yes, it is. I can't take her back. The memory of her betrayal is too much. Please, don't tell her yet. She nodded and hugged me. We talked a little more, avoiding the topic of Julia and Stephen. I promised to return the next day and left to see my grandson in the nursery. When I got there, Jake greeted me warmly and handed me a cigar. Here, Dad, for you to celebrate. I pocketed it, patting him on the back. Thanks, son. I'll save this for later. Seeing Julia and Stephen holding hands nearby, I felt a wave of nausea. Jake, I'll come back tomorrow when it's less crowded and, hopefully, the air will be fresher. You know what I mean. Jake chuckled. Absolutely. Dad, I get it. As I turned to leave, Julia called out shyly, John, doesn't it seem like just yesterday we were bringing Lisa home? Now we're grandparents. Time flies, doesn't it? I looked at her, still clinging to Stephen, and walked away without responding. October was a revelation. I went to Las Vegas to gamble away some of our joint assets, but I met Miranda instead, a mature, stunning woman in her 50s. She was still in her profession because, as she put it, some men preferred older women, and I found that true in my case. Miranda was expensive, but she made me feel more alive than I had in years. For the first time since Julia left, I didn't miss her at all. Miranda was not just beautiful, she was insightful. She listened to my whole story and, as she was leaving that evening, gently touched my face. John, I've met thousands of men in my life, and only a few are good and kind like you. Don't let her actions ruin you. If you ever come back to Vegas, call me. Miranda's words lingered with me. She was right. I wasn't going to let Julia's betrayal ruin my life. When I got back from Vegas, I asked my lawyer to draft the divorce papers. I also hired a private investigator to look into Stephen's history. I wanted to know everything about him, from high school to now. The firm was expensive, but I didn't care since half the cost would come from Julia's share. They promised a thorough investigation with a report ready by Christmas. I also inquired with my boss about relocating to one of our branch offices. He was surprised since I had always refused to move, but he understood when I explained my situation. He promised to look into it. Thanksgiving approached, another family holiday I dreaded. Lisa called a week before, begging me to join them for dinner. When I asked if Julia and Stephen would be there, she hesitated, then said yes. I firmly declined. Later, Jake called me. We arranged to meet at a bar downtown. Over drinks, I listened to Jake vent about his frustrations. Dad, you won't believe it. They're both infatuated with him, Julia and Lisa. It's all Stephen this, Stephen that. It's like he's some kind of hero or something. He took a sip of his drink, and I was surprised he wanted to persuade me to join them for Thanksgiving. Do you not like Stephen, Jake? I asked. Jake's face hardened with anger. No, Dad. He's arrogant, selfish, and just a jerk. He loves himself too much to love anyone else. I don't get what Julia sees in him. Realizing he had spoken too harshly, he quickly added, Sorry, I didn't mean to disrespect her. I smiled. Don't worry, son. When did you start calling her Julia instead of Mom? He looked down. Since she left you, I've lost respect for her. Curious, I asked, why does it bother you so much? He sighed. You never asked about my parents, and I appreciate that. My mom cheated on my dad. They separated, and my dad never got over it. He drank himself to death, and my mom died in a car accident with her lover. I hate cheaters, and now that Julia's one of them, I can't stand her. I hadn't known this about Jake's past and could see where his anger came from. What's worrying you, Jake? He ordered another drink before speaking. You're going to hate me for saying this, but the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Julia is teaching Lisa that it's okay to cheat. How long before Lisa thinks it's a good idea to try it out? I understood his concern. I see what you mean, but don't lose hope. Things are going to change soon, I promise. He smiled, relieved. As we were leaving, he finally asked, So, will you come to Thanksgiving, Dad? I shook my head. No, but thanks for the invite. Thanksgiving came, and I spent it alone, eating a TV dinner. It was lonely, but better than watching Julia and Stephen flaunt their relationship. December arrived, and with it, another holiday. I was apprehensive, but determined this would be the last one to endure. December turned out to be a fruitful month. I was offered a job transfer to Spokane, Washington, starting in January. I accepted. The private investigator's report on Stephen also arrived. It was a gold mine. Stephen had been married 3 times, all ending in divorce due to his infidelity. He had 2 children out of wedlock and was still paying child support. His last wife had taken half his pension in the divorce, and he had been demoted in rank during his final year in the Navy. Financially and morally, he was a wreck. The best news was that Julia would receive the divorce papers on the first business day after Christmas. Now I was truly in the holiday spirit. I called Lisa and asked about Christmas plans. She begged me to make it a family event. I asked if Stephen would be there. She snapped, Dad, you need to get used to it. He's part of our family now. I cut her off. All right, Lisa, I'll be there for the baby's sake. She seemed overjoyed. Thank you, Dad. This will make everyone so happy. I doubted that, but I decided to let it play out. 2 days before Christmas, I came home from work to a ringing phone. I answered without thinking. Hello? There was a pause, and then Julia's voice came on. John, it's me, Julia. What's wrong, Julia? Are you hurt? No, I'm fine, she said softly. I just wanted to thank you for agreeing to come for Christmas. I know I hurt you, and I'm beginning to see how much. I missed you so much at Thanksgiving, and I've been thinking a lot about us. I interrupted. Julia, I'm glad you're thinking of us. But remember, we agreed on no contact. I'm relaxing that for 1 day, Christmas. After that, we're done. Goodbye. I hung up, feeling terrible. I had never spoken to her so harshly, but no words could have been more painful than her leaving me. The days dragged, and I finished my Christmas shopping. I packed for my move to Spokane, rented a car, and prepared for my new life. I also made sure to get some gifts for everyone, knowing this would be our last Christmas together. I arrived at Lisa and Jake's on Christmas Day. Julia and Stephen were already there. Lisa hugged me warmly as I walked in with a bag of gifts. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, while I just smiled, thinking about the surprises I had planned. Jake shook my hand, and I asked, Can I see my grandson? He nodded. He's asleep in the nursery. Go ahead. I quietly entered the room and saw him, my beautiful grandson, sleeping peacefully. I was filled with emotion, knowing I would soon leave him. Julia joined me silently. Standing next to me, she whispered, He's perfect, isn't he? I answered, my voice tinged with sadness. Yes, Julia, but who will he call Grandpa? Me or that fool? Or both? Julia seemed stunned by the question. John, of course, you're the only grandfather. I muttered, Let's hope so, and left the room. The rest of the evening was a blur. Jim and I talked while Lisa, Julia, and Stephen seemed lost in their own world. Watching them made me sick, but I held my peace, knowing tonight would change everything. Dinner was served. The food was delicious, but the conversation was lacking. Stephen dominated the discussion, boasting about his Navy days, while the women hung on his every word. I felt like an outsider, and Jim seemed equally disconnected. After dinner, Lisa brought the baby into the living room, and we sat around together. I knew this would likely be the last time I'd be in this family setting. Lisa seemed genuinely happy as she asked Jake to bring over the gifts. They handed them out. Julia got a sweater, Stephen a gift card, and I got a tie. Useful, but boring, much like the image Julia had of me. When Lisa, Jake, and the baby opened their gifts from Julia and Stephen, Lisa smiled and laughed, but Jake was polite but distant. Once the gifts were opened, the room grew quiet as they looked at me, wondering if I had brought anything. Breaking the silence, I said, I wanted to end this special day by giving you all gifts that you truly deserve. I grabbed the bag and handed Lisa and Jake a large envelope. Lisa tore into the wrapping, and when she saw what was inside, she screamed with joy. Julia leaned forward, curious. Lisa quickly explained, Mom, Dad gave us the house, mortgage-free. We can finally move out of this rental. Julia's face dropped. She turned to me, confused. Why would you do this? John, where will we live? I gave her a cold smile. Don't worry, Julia. I've taken care of everything. Here, this is for you. I handed her a card and a small box. She opened it with hopeful anticipation, finding a bracelet inside. Turn it over. Julia, I instructed. She did, reading the inscription, Thank you for the best 25 years of my life. John. She looked confused. John, this is beautiful, but you forgot to add with love. I smiled. No, Julia, I didn't forget. I just didn't want to lie. This bracelet is a farewell. You see, you will be served with divorce papers on Monday. I heard Lisa gasp, and Julia's face turned pale with shock. Look inside the cart, Julia. There's a check for half of our liquid assets, $180,000. It's all yours. I spent the rest during your absence. The house was mine to give away after you left our marriage, and that's all explained in the card, too. I turned to Stephen, enjoying the shock on his face. This next gift is for you, Stephen. I handed him an envelope. It's your history from high school to now. I think Julia will find it enlightening. Before I could finish, Stephen lunged at me, screaming, I'll kill you. But he didn't get far before I tased him. He dropped to the floor, convulsing. Lisa stood, and Julia cried out as I tased him twice more for good measure. I leaned in close, whispering, Hurts, doesn't it? Well, your pain is nothing compared to losing my wife of 25 years to garbage like you. Julia was crying hysterically. I turned to her, saying, I know you think I'm boring and predictable and that I don't curl your toes like him, pointing to Stephen on the floor, but I am giving you the best gift, freedom. Now, you can spend your days being treated like a princess and your nights having your toes curled. Isn't that what you wanted? Julia, through her tears, managed to say, No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I was going to come back to you. John, I love you. I felt no sympathy. It's too late. Julia, you made your choice. Enjoy your freedom. I turned to leave. Jim tried to intervene. Maybe you shouldn't tase him again. It could kill him. I shrugged. Maybe, but I doubt it. Anyway, I'm leaving. Thanks for a wonderful day and a memorable life. Goodbye, everyone. I doubt I'll see you again. I walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. As I reached my car, I heard Julia scream, No, this can't be happening. I smiled to myself. Maybe a stop in Vegas on the way to Spokane wouldn't be so bad. As I started the car, I saw Jake come out, waving and smiling. I waved back, ready for a fresh start. That's the dramatic story of John, who faced the ultimate betrayal by his wife, Julia, and her high school sweetheart, Stephen. What would you do if you were in John's shoes? Would you forgive or take the same bold steps he did? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe for more incredible stories.
Thanks for hanging out with me on today's episode, brother. I'm Jack, host of this podcast, and it's great having you here. If today's story hit home, send it on to a buddy who might need it. Remember, we're all in this together, turning life's curvy balls into wins. If you have an opinion or story to share, then drop a line in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out. Until next time, keep your chin up and keep pushing forward. Stay strong, folks.